So I love a lot of the elements of this morning's service. I'm going to talk about several of them we've already mentioned. But this morning's reading from the Reverend Lynn Unger, who's a friend of mine. She says, "Come down from the hills and declare the fighting done." Now, her words were written several years ago, but this year they feel more poignant than ever. Because, of course, there is fighting once again in the part of the world we're talking about. And I'm reluctant even to name exactly where we're talking about because that gets really complicated. The different names carry great symbolic weight. And I struggled a lot this week with what to say because about this issue, more so than almost any other, it's so easy to say the wrong thing or to fail to say the right thing. Now, I'm glad that our Unitarian Universalist Association and our new president, the Reverend Sophia Betancourt, have supported a ceasefire in Gaza because none of us want violence. No one wants people to die. And a ceasefire, from what I know, seems like the appropriate first step. Solutions beyond that will be, I fear, very complicated and difficult. I don't feel qualified to offer suggestions even. But it's part of why I chose our Time for All Ages today, the Latka Who Couldn't Stop Screaming, which I love. It's very funny, of course. But it was also a very intentional pick on my part because it is unpleasant to be told what you should do or think by someone who is not you, someone who does not know your experience. I don't think it's my place to tell people half a world away what I think they should do or how they should feel or who they should be. I don't think it's any of our places to tell people we don't know, whose lives we are not living, what is right for them. That's one of the reasons I've been very judicious in my words about Israel and Gaza, about Israelis and Palestinians. Well, my hope today is that we can learn something from the story of Hanukkah in this time of year in which it is celebrated, because we are often told a story that comes not so much from history or even from the scriptural witness. Instead, as with so many holidays in our lives, we are told what the marketing departments of large companies want us to hear and feel. So we hear about presents, which, as our Latka pointed out, is not actually a big part of Hanukkah. We do hear about the 8 nights of candles, which are a very important part of Hanukkah. And if we really listen, we might hear that it has something to do with oil and a miracle. And so all of this is true, or at least has little bits of truth in it. A strong aura of what the TV satirist Stephen Colbert called truthiness. It sort of feels like it's true, whether it's actually true or not. And so I want to expand and complicate the story of Hanukkah for you today. So first, let's go back to the 2nd century BCE, about 2,200 years ago. And here we get to the complicated part, what is a part of modern-day Israel, but was then known mostly as Judea, a mountainous, arid area south and east of Jerusalem. Now, the history gets complicated quickly because it's the world we live in, but it's important to have some context, a little understanding of the society of the day. It's important to know that this was then part of the huge area that Alexander the Great had conquered. Not that long before this, in fact. And it was in this part of it that one of his generals had been put in charge and founded the Seleucid dynasty, that is a dynasty of Greek-speaking rulers of that area. Over time, some Jews, in fact, had learned to speak Greek, had grown friendly or at least accommodating to those in power. Other Jews, especially those from lower social classes or in more rural areas, did not do this as much. And after a lot of conflicts, some court intrigue, and various arguments about things like whether it was okay for Greek gods to also be worshipped in addition to the God of the Jews, and then there was a prohibition against various Jewish ritual practices, a revolt broke out. First, a priest named Mattathias took a stand against that prohibition of Jewish practices. and thereby indirectly against the Seleucid rulers. He and his sons, especially one named Judas, organized the people to fight the Seleucid armies. Mattathias died shortly after the revolt began, but his son Judas took over and earned the nickname Maccabee, which most people believe comes from the Hebrew word for hammer, as in he was so strong in breaking through things, his fighting abilities. The family came to take this as their last name, which is why we talk and sing about the Maccabees, as we did earlier. Now, one of the complicating factors I like to point out is it's important to remember the class implications here. Though the Maccabees did come from the priestly class, most of their followers were poor farmers from the hills who were angry not just at their foreign rulers, but also at the elite Jewish classes that had aligned with them. The Maccabees, employing what we today would call guerrilla tactics, surprise, ambush, repeatedly defeated superior forces. So in short, the context into which we place the story of Hanukkah is one of a military campaign of violence, all sorts of historical and economic implications. It's the sort of thing one could easily try, for instance, to use to support one's position in the modern context of fighting in Gaza and Israel, as I have seen people do. Now, the next part of the story you probably know something about, and it's the one that I think is the most important, one I really want to emphasize today. Because the Maccabees drove the Seleucids from Jerusalem, they recaptured the sacred temple, which was in disarray, and there they found just a little bit of already consecrated oil, and so they relit the eternal flame with it. Now, we're told that they relit it knowing they didn't have enough oil, and that it would take 8 days to make more of the oil. And that tiny bit of oil, which should have been enough to last 1 night, instead lasted for 8. Just long enough to make more oil, and so keep the eternal flame lit. I'm struck by a lot of things in the story. There's a lot of rich symbolism that has been appealing to people for 2,000 years now. There's the miracle of the oil lasting. There's a story of restoring the Jewish people to their religious ways. If you want to pull it out, there's something about self-rule and democracy, perhaps. Again, a lot of symbolism that could be used in many differing, even opposing ways in our world today. And so all of that matters, but today I want to emphasize a different aspect of the story, because when rabbis began to collect and tell these stories and do what we call canonize them, that is, make them into a form that is handed down as official or semi-official, when they did that, they didn't cast Hanukkah primarily as a story of military triumph. Instead, they focused on the miracle of the lamp that stayed lit for 8 nights. 8 nights of peace and rebuilding in the aftermath of battle. And so we can view Hanukkah as a story of the peace, not of the war. And this is really important in our world today. We don't have to know all of the solutions to all of our world's problems, but we have to remain committed to peace, not to war. And so I want to share with you today some words from the Reverend Dan Schatz, who serves our sibling congregation just up the road in Westchester. He writes, "The word Hanukkah means dedication. In Judaism, this festival celebrates the rededication of the temple after a terrible civil war devastated Jewish society and the city of Jerusalem. After that time, the Maccabees, victorious in the battle, ritually cleaned the temple and lit the sacred lamps. As most of us know, there was only enough oil for 1 night, but by a miracle, it lasted 8 nights. I think maybe the Maccabees needed those 8 nights," he says, because they had to rededicate themselves as well. They had been warriors, but now the people needed to learn to live with each other as neighbors again. The Maccabees had to turn from battle to peacemaking. That the Jewish community stayed together and that the festival of Hanukkah is still celebrated today is proof they succeeded. His final thoughts. As war rages in Israel and Palestine today, my hope and prayer is for that kind of rededication, from war to peace, from destruction to rebuilding, from tearing the fabric of society to weaving it anew, so that in a coming day there will be not merely an absence of war, but the presence of a just peace for all the people. And so ends his words. As I said, it's not my job, it's not our jobs to solve every one of the world's problems. We can't do that. But it is our job to remain dedicated to peace and to justice, to a world where violence may finally be a thing of the past. So today my prayer is for that to become true. May it be so.